In this presentation, we will take a look at company preferences, focusing in on the general preferences within QuickBooks Pro 2019. For more accounting information and accounting courses, visit our website at accountinginstruction.info. Here we are with the Home tab, Open Items window. We're going to go to the drop-down for the preferences if it's not open already in the Edit drop-down, and then go to the Preferences at the bottom. So we're going to select Preferences. And last time we had entered preferences for the checking account. We're going to go down to, and skipping down this time, to the General Preferences. So we are now in the General Preferences. We once again have two tabs. We have the My Preferences and the Company Preferences. We are currently in the My Preferences. Now, most of these, the defaults are good. I'm going to keep the defaults for most of them, but these are areas where people might have their own personal preference on how they want to enter data. They are also areas where if you go to a different computer and someone has changed this preference, it'll start to kind of drive you crazy if you're not used to it. So you want to just be aware that these preferences are there, so that and you know why the system might be acting a little bit differently if you go from place to place, because some people have these types of preferences or differences in how data should be input, or make it a little bit faster to enter data. So one is to pressing enter moves between fields. So when we start entering data into the system, typically we enter and we will use the tab key to run through the data rather than clicking with the mouse each time. That's really slow to click with the mouse as compared to hitting a key. Typically we hit the tab key, that's the default. But if you like to hit the enter key to go through the data, that might be a little bit faster for some people. We're going to keep the default as just the tab key. I think it's really useful to get to know the keystrokes as you go through it, and the tab is probably the best one to use because it applies not only to QuickBooks, but to other types of data, pretty much any database program. So then we have automatically open drop-down list when typing. This is really useful if we are typing in data, say like an expense or say like an account, and we start to type in information. It'll automatically open the drop-down list and start to autofill the options of the accounts that could be there and be the correct option. So I really would want that one and keep that one there. This is another one that a lot of people will turn off. Beep when recording a transaction. Now, this could sound really annoying, and it can be, especially if you're recording a lot of transactions. But it's also useful because if you don't hear that beep, it's possible to enter transactions and then close the checking account without actually completing the transaction and not actually record the transaction. So the beep can be useful in giving us that final awareness for like, it has been recorded, but it could also be something you may want to turn off. So automatically place a decimal point. And this is another one of those ones that some people really like, just typing in the number and the decimal point being placed, and some people like to type the decimal point every time in there and always put pennies in as we type in the keys. So this one will be one of those things that you could start to enter data into a system, and if it's not on the custom that you are used to, then it could be something that be a bit weird. And just note that that's going to be the preference, and that'll be a preference that different people could have. If you go from system to system, computer to computer, that could be different. You just got to get used to whatever's there, and whatever you're using, it seems to me, is just something that you will get used to and tend to prefer. That's my experience with it. So then we have warn with the editing a transaction. Also a useful thing to have. If we're going to edit a lot of transactions, of course, we may want to uncheck this because we're going to get a warning every time we go back and edit a transaction. Why would QuickBooks do this as a default? Because typically we don't want to go, it's bad practice to go back and change transactions because it's not good for the audit trail. So typically we don't want to do that. We want to fix things by making new transactions so that we can see the mistake and how we fixed it. But of course QuickBooks allows us to delete the transactions and change them. So we want to be careful when we do that. And so the warning sign is to tell us to be careful. But again, if we know what we're doing, we're confident, or we're going to do a lot of transactions, we may want to take that off. Bring back all one-time messages. I'm going to keep that off as the default. Turn off pop-up messages for products and services. Probably something we don't want, pop-up messages, kind of like advertisements. They are good advertisements because they're from QuickBooks, And they're probably things that we may want to consider, such as payroll or something like that to add to our services. But typically, when less pop-ups is usually better. And then show tool tips for clipped text. I'm going to keep that checked. Warn when deleting a transaction or unused list item. And again, that's just going to be a little pop-up. Then when we delete a list item or transaction, it's going to tell us, do you really want to do that? And we do want to be careful when we do that. Again, if we're doing a lot and we know what we're doing, we might want to turn this off because it'll give us a pop-up every time. If we do not, and it's a good thing to have because it'll give us that last check and say, QuickBooks is telling me this might not be a good idea. Maybe I should double check just to make sure it's what we want to do. Automatically recall information. Automatically remember account or transaction information. We can either have automatically recall last transaction for this name or pre-fill accounts for vendor based on past entries. The default here, again, very useful because it'll basically remember the last transaction, especially if we are entering bills. And we start to enter bills and we say, okay, we entered the Verizon bill or the phone bill, the AT&T, whoever the phone company is, last time. It'll remember that transaction again and help us to autofill the data in it. And of course, after we do that first month of operations, the following months will be much the same. Our bills look surprisingly similar from month to month. So that autofill feature is nice because it'll start to remember what is happening. Now we want to make sure once it does autofill that we do make the changes necessary, such as if the amount changes, then we got to make those changes. But it does save a lot of time to have that. So I will keep the default. Default to use for new transactions. Let me read that again. Default date to use for new transactions. So what date should we use for new transactions? Should it be use today's date as the default? And if you're always working in the current time period, that's a good default to have. If you're working in, say, a problem like we're doing here, then we probably don't want just the current date because we're always going to have to change the date because we're not going to be working within the current date. If you're entering data for a whole series of information, or you don't always enter the data, at the current point in time, then you're not going to want that as the default because you'll have to change the date from the current date every time. Or this isn't the default, but you want to keep their default, which is to use the last date entered as the default. So that way, if you're entering a whole series, like if you're entering data from the banking account into the system and you're entering a lot of transactions, then it'll just remember the last transaction. Or if you're entering a whole month of credit card transactions, then you don't want it to keep on going to the current date because you want it to go to the date of when you made the transaction charge. And so this default is usually the better option unless we're completely current all the time and then working on the current date. Keep custom item information when changing item in the transactions. Going to keep the default as the ask. So we're going to go to the company preferences now. We got the company preferences. Show portions of an hour as either a decimal or in minutes. Again, this is one of those types of preferences that it's just a preference, and it's one of those conversion things that we have with time. How do we want to see time? Do we want to see time in minutes? And 60 minutes doesn't convert to partial hours as nicely as we would like, right? So we can have either a decimal in terms of hours when we're working with things like hourly wages, or we can have it remain in minutes. We'll keep the default in minutes. Always show years in 4 digits. So that'll be just a custom of how we're going to show the year. Never update name information when saving transactions. We'll keep the default. Save transactions before printing. And that's going to basically say that if we are printing something, we're going to save the transaction and then print it. So printing will basically default and save the transaction to make sure that whatever we are printing is actually recorded in the system. So that's good for the default. And then manage login settings, so we can log off every time a user closes the company or exits the QuickBooks file. This is probably good because that's going to be the most secure way that we have it. So if we log off, if it logs off when we close the QuickBooks file, that means that every time we open it back up, then of course we'll have to log back in. If we want to be a little bit quicker and save some time, we can keep the user login for however many time periods that we would want. Again, I think the default is probably the safest way to go. It doesn't take too much time to log in and out of QuickBooks. For more accounting information and accounting courses, visit our website at accountinginstruction.info.